One of the most cost-effective ways and the easiest way to filter an aquarium is by using air. Now there's a few ways of filtering with air. You can use like a moving bed filter, you can use sponge filters, box filters, etc. And they're all relatively pretty easy to either DIY yourself or to buy very inexpensively. Now, one of the big things about using air that makes it very attractive and easy to use for a lot of people is that it is very inexpensive. Sponge filters usually range in the $10 range, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. Box filters are around the same, etc. So you could theoretically filter an aquarium for very little money. So let's say that you have a 40-gallon aquarium and you put a couple of sponge filters in there. Might be, you know, $20 worth of sponge filters and airline tubing, and then you'll just need a decent air pump, which might cost you another 20 bucks or so. And for $40, you have a filter that can filter very efficiently a 40-gallon aquarium, and is very easy to clean. It's very easy to maintenance and doesn't draw a lot of energy. So when you think about cost, you're not only thinking about the cost of the filter itself, but also how much does it cost to keep that filter running all the time. If you have, you know, a powerful canister filter or, you know, some large hang on the back filter that is pulling a lot of energy from the grid, then you are paying for that. So with the air filter or with a sponge filter, you can do multiple tanks with just one filter. So as an example, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, but I run every tank in this fish room. So I've got 23 tanks in this fish room, ranging from 10 gallons to 125 gallons and everything in between. And it's all running on one air pump. So I've got one thing plugged into the wall that's filtering all of these tanks. Now I happen to use sponge filters. I find them to be very easy to use. You know, aesthetically, they're not always the most pleasing, but if you can find out, you know, ways to kind of hide them and mask them behind pieces of wood, rocks, decorations, plants, etc., they can be hidden very well. And you know, if you can get past that part, then it's not that bad. One of the things that I don't like about sponge filters, though, is having to clean them. Now, some of them are very easy because they don't have a lot of maintenance required. So I might, you know, have it in a tank where I might have to clean the sponge filter once every 2 or 3 months, and that's fine. But some of my messier tanks with my African cichlids, with my Oscars here behind me, they are messier, and I'm having to clean these sponge filters a whole lot more. So there is a new sponge filter on the market that I'm very excited to test and try out, and it's going to alleviate a lot of those problems that I'm having with having to clean the sponge filters in those messier tanks. So what we have here is we have a sponge filter that is relatively new to the market. This one is manufactured and sold by Aquarium Co-op. So aquariumcoop.com is where you can find these. Now, I do have to say that this is not a paid advertisement. This is not a paid video, but I didn't pay for these sponge filters. They sent me a huge shipment of sponge filters. I got 43 of them, and they also sent me some never-clog air stones for me to put together, which I'll talk about shortly. But they're not paying me to say this. They gave me the sponge filters, but I had asked for them, and the reason why is that this coarse sponge material. So the difference between these sponge filters and a lot of the other sponge filters out there is that the sponge material itself is very coarse, which means that it's not going to get clogged as easily. Now, some of you may have some concerns and questions regarding polishing. So some of the finer sponge filters do polishing, meaning they remove some of those very small particulates from the water column so that your water appears to be clearer. And if you do have a very coarse sponge, it may not do that as well. So I do understand that that could be an issue. So that is something that I am going to be monitoring over the next few weeks as I install all these filters. And I do have some options where I can double stack filters and maybe put a finer filter in the middle or on top. So as an example, for the Oscar tank here, we are triple stacking sponges. So this is actually 3 sponge filters just stacked together. So you're able to stack these sponge filters together. And right now I'm going to run all 3 coarse. But if I find in a couple of weeks that I have some issues with some water clarity, I might swap out one of them and put a finer sponge on there. But for now, I'm just going to run the way they are. I think it's going to make my life a lot easier, not having to clean out the sponge filters as often, because that can become arduous, a lot of work, and I just don't want to do it. The other thing about these sponge filters, which is a little bit different, is that you can attach an air line in the middle of the sponge filter, and you can put an air stone in there. So I happen to cut little pieces of air tubing. I'll put some B-roll here. I cut little pieces of air tubing and I attach a never-clog air stone to every single piece of tubing, and then that's installed inside here. You can kind of hear it rattling around. So what's happening is the air is going through the sponge filter, it's hitting that air stone, and then that air is going a little bit deeper into the sponge than normally. So normally this air is just kind of hitting the top, and then the force of the bubbles are creating a current, and it's going back up, and that's what's drawing water through the sponge filter. So having the air stone down in the middle of the sponge is increasing that airflow, but also you can regulate the size of the bubbles with an air stone, which you can't with just an air tube attached to a sponge filter. So the next step for me is to start going around and start swapping out these sponge filters. Now, some of you may be concerned about me swapping out a sponge filter without having it cycled, and that is a reasonable concern. So you do have to remember that when you have beneficial bacteria in an aquarium, there is bacteria all over. So that means it's on the surface of the glass, it's on rocks and wood and decorations. There's a ton of bacteria in the substrate. So if you're using gravel or sand or coral or aragonite, whatever, there's tons of bacteria in there. But having said that, because I don't want to have any ammonia spikes, because I don't want to have anything crash, I am going to do this in stages. So as an example, in the Oscar tank, I've got 3 filters in there. I've got, well, 4 because I've double stacked the sponge filter. But I've got 2 sponge filters in there, and then I've got the 2 Zis filters. So what I'll do is I'll swap out the sponge filters. I still have the Zis filters running, so there is bacteria in there. Same thing with the Mbuna tank right here, where I've got double stacked sponge filters. I've got 2 on each side, so there's a total of 4 in there. So I'll do one side at one time, and then I'll swap and do the other side. For those tanks where I only have a sponge filter and I don't have a secondary sponge filter in there, what I will do is I will connect a air pump and run that sponge filter in there for a few days. And in other cases, I might take a sponge filter and stick it in a sump upstairs or stick it in another tank so that I can start to grow some beneficial bacteria on it and then do the swap. So it's not going to be like me going through and swapping out every sponge filters in the same day, because I do have to go through that process. So it's going to be over the next couple of weeks where I'm slowly migrating from one sponge filter to the other, and then eventually I'll be done. Now, earlier I had mentioned how I filter this entire room with one air pump. Now, there are a lot of tanks in here, so I'm not talking about like your regular air pump that you're going to use for, you know, a couple of aquariums. This is just something that I would use for maybe 1 to 6 tanks. I've actually run about 6 tanks per filter or per pump with one of these. It's kind of like a dual outlet. So you could, if you had a couple of those, you could do like 12 tanks or something like that. But with this many tanks, obviously that's not going to work. So you need something that's a lot more robust. I currently have a central air pump that's behind this curtain. That is something that I purchased from Gemco, and it's a larger diaphragm air pump that can do like 30 or so aquariums. But recently I was contacted by a company that has a air pump called the Fuji Mac. So this is a company based in Japan, hence the name Fuji. And I am told that it's going to be distributed by Hikari. So I'm not sure if that's going to be like Aquarium Solutions or Hikari, but it is going to be rebranded. And this thing is a beast. So they sold me this thing. I got to pick it up here. And this is what a large central air pump looks like. This is a little bit larger than the one that I currently have. This one puts out about 60 liters per minute. So pretty good amount of airflow. It'll easily do this tank. I could probably do easily 40 to 50 tanks with that bad boy there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to swap out the air filter or the air pump as well. Now, there's nothing wrong with my air pump, my existing Gemco. I do have it, and I also have a backup kit for it so that I can rebuild the diaphragm if something happens to fail. But I do have this one now, and I want to give it a try. I want to try because I want to see what the airflow is like. I want to see you know, what the output is like. But I also want to see what the noise level is like. So right now you can't really hear it because I've got a fan running in here, and there are the bubbles, but I do want to see, you know, how quiet it is, what the noise level is like. Maybe I'll get like a decibel meter and try to do a test, but I also want to see the output, and I want to see the quality of how this thing works. So that is something that I'm going to be trying in the near future as well. So I'm going to hook that bad boy up to my central air system. I will make a video about that, so that will be more to come in the future. And then I'll be swapping out these all these sponge filters. I did want to mention that besides just the fish room downstairs where everything's running on one central air pump, I did put the new sponge filters in every one of my systems. So that means the Tanganyika tank behind me, my Malawi tank behind me over there, my planted tank with my discus and cardinals. I've got a couple small tanks in my office with a betta and with some guppies, and even the koi outside has a sponge filter. So everything that I have that has living animals in them with water is getting one of these sponge filters. Now you may be wondering how I got a sponge filter in some of these tanks, like for example my Malawi tank where I've got the 3D background and you can't really see any filtration. That's hiding down in the sump. And then in some of the other tanks, I just hid it behind like a rock or, you know, wood and plants and stuff like that, so you can't really see it. So anyway, that is the video, just kind of an update on what's going on. Some of you have seen my Instagram posts. If you're not following me on Instagram, you definitely need to follow me on Instagram because you find out things there a lot sooner than you do on YouTube. So follow me on Instagram at Tazawa_Tanks. And so anyway, I made a video a couple weeks ago talking about all these sponge filters I got, and so here's the update. So anyway, I'm going to start swapping these out in the coming weeks, and I will give you guys an update when it's all done, and I'm also going to show you the new Fuji Mac. Don't forget to hit that like button, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching, catch you on the next one.